Hi everyone, this is Mrs. H Psychology and AQA Psychology specifically, but it would apply to other specifications too. In AQA, the approaches is in paper 2, and we're looking today at the humanistic approach, so humanism. And part 1 of my videos on humanism for the exam questions was dealing with some essay questions. This is just going to deal with the short sort of assumption questions. So how do we get 4 marks for a particular assumption? Okay, so it's just tackling short answers, but you could use this in your essays as well. So any of this information could be applied in your essays. Okay, so this is part 2, how to tackle exam questions. So if I bring up the specific question, let's have a look at that. Okay, so this question is how would we get 4 marks from any of these key assumptions? So this was from June 06. Yes, it was the old spec, but we can still be asked the same sort of questions. They're going to be very similar. So this one was, in the context of humanistic psychology, outline what is meant by each of the following. So they asked you to talk about promoting personal growth, the valuing of individual experience, or the concept of free will. Okay, so how would we go about, if you needed to, getting 4 marks from these? And this is really to help you with your key terminology. So a lot of students I've seen in the past just give very vague notions and they don't get credit. So it is important that you're using your terminology and showing your understanding of what that means. So I'm going to just run through that and hope that this will help you. Okay, so let's have a look at one of these. So first one, personal growth or self-actualization. Okay, so we need a few bits and bobs of other terminology. So personal growth or self-actualization, really what that's saying, and what we need to be saying, is that it believes, that the humanists believe, that we have an innate tendency, so we're born with it, a biologically driven innate tendency to achieve personal growth, strive towards self-actualization, okay, meaning realizing your full potential. So we've got a couple of nice key points in there. In other words, what does that mean in order to develop that? If we wanted to, changing, becoming more fulfilled, satisfied, and achieving in life. Okay, so that certainly this would probably get you, a couple of marks credit. I would then go on, if you needed 4 marks from this, go on to expand how either Rogers or Maslow would say that that is achieved. Okay, so Rogers obviously becoming a fully functioning person, in other words, closing the gap between the real and the ideal, gaining congruence between the real and the ideal self. For Maslow, obviously, you'd make reference to the hierarchy of needs, maybe talking about the bottom needs, the deficiency needs, and working you up to the growth needs or self-actualization. All right, so 2 marks really from this, and 2 marks for picking one of these if you needed it as an illustration, Rogers or Maslow, and how they achieved that. So that would be dealing with your self-actualization. Let's look at another key assumption. Okay, so let's look at second one. Let's stick with this, what we call phenomenology, or a person-centered approach. The humanists believed that this person's subjective view was much more important than objective reality. And in class we've talked about that, real examples which make a lot of sense. You might see a situation from your point of view, but you're really trying to understand it from that same situation from that person's point of view, and sometimes they are very, very different. So the humanists believe in this phenomenology, the person's subjective view is much more important than objective reality. We need to develop that a little bit. We are all unique. They believe we're absolutely unique, and therefore assuming that we're all going to behave in the same way, like the behaviourists, for example, is not logical to them. So what they say is that we should be studying the uniqueness of those individuals from their subjective viewpoint, and that's why they would choose to use case studies. And we know that case studies are a method that just deals with one individual or a small group with something similar, and we're getting an in-depth, detailed look at that person, as opposed to looking at whole groups, taking a very normathetic approach, looking at whole groups to gather, effectively percentages of how many people will behave in a certain way. The humanists are not interested in that. They want to know why you behave in that specific way. So you could develop it that way, or you could develop it in terms of, in other words, finding meaning from life from within yourself rather than the external world. In other words, Rogers, and you can develop it a little bit with his client-centered therapy, closing the gap, and so on. So that's another way to get 4 marks from this very person-centered approach if you needed to expand on it and explain what's meant by it. Let's look at the third one, free will. Okay, so yes, it is free to choose, that the person is free to choose, but that's not enough. It won't get you very far. So we need to refer to some of these other terms. So free will, yes, is that you are free to choose, but free to act within your own character. In other words, that you are not being, your behavior is not being predetermined by environmental or biological or unconscious factors like the other approaches, but you have what we call personal agency. And what that means is that you are free from coercion and constraint. So you can reject behaviors, reject actions at will. They are your choice. So we can see that's a very different response to just saying, yep, we're free to choose. Okay. You may also, as part of one of the essays or even specifically, be asked to make comparisons to why they're seen as unscientific and so on and so forth, or why they reject science. So here, specifically, they do reject a scientific approach, and we need to really be able to expand on that, particularly to be able to make comparison with the other approaches. So what do we want to say for this? We want to say that every person is unique, and so we can only really explain that person's viewpoint, we can only really understand that person by seeing them from that unique perspective, from their subjective view. And we call that phenomenology. In other words, as I've said before, the person's subjective view is greater than objective reality. So therefore, the subjective view is more important, as we say, than objective reality. So therefore, general rules of behaviour, laws of behaviour, so in other words, a non-aesthetic approach, would not be relevant to really getting a full understanding of that person. And you could make reference to case studies as I've done above. Or you could argue humanists believe we can exercise free will. We have personal agency where we decide our own actions. So in other words, refer to those terms we've just done up here. However, the scientific approach believes that all behaviour is predetermined and all behaviour has a cause. Okay, so pure science believes there is a cause, even if we don't know the cause. And that is what science is expecting us to have, a deterministic view. So the humanists reject this very scientific hard determinism because they believe that we have an option, we are free to choose, etc. So